In today's game, we see how Bobby Fischer handles the hardest opening to beat in chess. Now, what opening is that? Well, when a top grandmaster with the black pieces doesn't want to lose a game and is okay with the draw, the opening they often go to is the Petrov's defense. The main goal of the Petrov's defense is to keep things as symmetrical as possible. And that is what Fischer's opponent plays against him in this game. But watch how he uses a secret that will be revealed in this game to deal with an opening like this, whether it is the Petrov's defense or anything else. Fischer, of course, has white. His opponent is an international master named German from Brazil. This game was played in the Interzonal in Stockholm in 1962. Let us begin. Fischer begins, of course, with e4, e5, knight f3, and knight to f6. This is the Petrov's defense, and you see basically black is just mimicking what white is doing for the time being. The most common option for white is to go ahead and take that pawn at e5, but here Fischer plays d4, giving his opponent a chance to mix things up a little bit. Taking on e4 is the main move, and after bishop d3, d5, knight takes e5. White does have some interesting play here after, say, knight to c3, but if you notice, the pawn structure is completely symmetrical, so black would have gotten what he wanted in that position. But black instead takes on d4 with the pawn, allowing Fischer to gain space with e5, hitting that knight. The knight goes to e4, and here the main move by far is actually queen takes d4. It's not a bad move, but the main response from black here is d5, and after white takes en passant, knight takes d6. And white has a decent score from this position, but again, look, the pawn structures are completely symmetrical, and players of the Petrov's defense know how to handle these positions. So instead, Fischer plays queen to e2, and that lines his queen up against black's king as well as threatening the knight, and now this idea of d5 isn't really playable for black, because when white takes en passant, the knight cannot recapture it as pinned to the king. So he couldn't play d5 after queen to e2, so he plays knight to c5, knight takes d4. After knight to c6, Fischer exchanges on c6, and black can take with the d-pawn here. That's acceptable, although white does have a healthy pawn majority, and black's queenside pawn majority is crippled. That's not the end of the world, but black goes ahead and captures toward the center, following that basic principle. And now look at the structure. It's very asymmetrical. So any idea that this was going to be a symmetrical structure is now out the window. Fischer used queen to e2 combined with d4 to create an asymmetrical pawn structure. And now this opening is going to be an opening where white can win. You're going to have an unbalanced, sharp, attacking game, which is not what black usually wants when they play the Petrov's defense. Knight to c3 from Fischer, rook to b8, putting the rook on the half-open file, and f4, gaining space. And those of you who know opening theory will recognize that this position looks very similar to a Scotch game. It has that same sort of pawn structure. Perhaps g6, controlling f5, would have been a better move here. Black wants to play d6, but he can't do it because of the queen on e2. But white would just take, and black would be in check. But instead, black plays bishop to e7 to clear the way for kingside castling. Now queen to f2. Fischer wants to play bishop to e3 and gain a tempo against that knight on c5. d5 from black, and now bishop to e3. Attacks that knight. The knight moves to d7, and he can't really take that pawn at a7. After rook to b2, black is perfectly fine. So Fischer castles long. Now we know black's not going to castle long because the rook is already moved and there are all these pieces in the way too. So Fischer is planning on opposite sides castling, and he wants to use these E and F pawns to help him attack on the king side. Black does castle, and again, this pawn at a7, you don't want to take that. You would just be opening lines for black against white's king, so that pawn is sort of poisoned. Fischer doesn't mess with that. He just goes ahead with g4, continuing his attack on the king side. At some point, he would like to play f5 and maybe even f6, if possible. Can't do that yet because the pawn at e5 would fall, but he wants to prepare that. Bishop to b4, threatening to take the knight, which would really wreck his pawn structure. Fischer cannot allow black to take that knight and wreck that structure. He plays knight to e2. Maybe a better, even slightly better move was knight to a4. if Fischer could get a clamp on these c5 and d4 squares, he would be in very good shape. But knight to e2 is also a good move. It can go to d4, and also go to g3, where they're attacking squares on f5 and h5. So the knight has a lot of potential. In fact, black probably should have played c5 here to keep the knight out of d4, and of course he could play d4 later himself. But he plays knight to b6. Makes sense, and I can go to c4 or a4, assist in the attack. Knight to d4 from Fischer, not just threatening the c6 pawn, but also if his knight were to land on c6, he would be forking the queen and the rook. So black has to do something about that. He plays queen to e8, c3, kicks the bishop, and now the bishop goes back to e7. And remember, we said Fischer wanted to advance this pawn, but there was too much pressure on e5. Well, now there's no pressure on e5, and he is free to advance. And this is not the kind of position black wants when they play the Petrov's defense. I can assure you of that. This is not... White has everything he wants here. c5 kicks the knight goes to b5, threatening the c7 pawn. d4 is played by black, counterattacking. You can't take on c7 here, just queen to d7, and the knight is sort of trapped, but he's also attacking the knight and the bishop at e3, so that doesn't work. The bishop has to move. And he goes to f4 to help strengthen that e5 pawn. Pawn takes, and of course he retakes with a knight. He doesn't damage his pawn structure by taking with the pawn. Knight to a4, a very key idea from black, and a strong move, or at least a strong idea, to trade off the knight defending the king. So when your opponent has a knight defending the king, you want to trade it off and limit the defense of the king. But Fischer's solution to this challenge was really brilliant. First he plays bishop to b5, attacking the queen and the knight. And it looks like he's giving up two minor pieces for a rook, which would not be a good exchange for him. Black takes the bishop with the rook, but Fischer does not take the rook, he takes the knight at a4. And now he keeps his defensive knight. He doesn't have to give it up. Really a smart maneuver there from Fischer. Rook to b4, attacks the knight just goes back to c3, and now it is comfortably on its defensive perch. Bishop to b7, the bishop goes in the long light square diagonal, the rook moves, centralizes, places itself opposite black's queen, king to h8, and now Fischer plays the move that he was really hoping for from the beginning of his pawn storm, f6. This is a very powerful move. We see, obviously, the fact that the rook is opposite the queen is really bad news. Black could not take because after he retakes, the bishop would be lost because of the pin. So he just plays the bishop back to d8. But now a really sneaky move from Fischer. Bishop to g5, with a nasty tactic that is threatened. He's threatening to take on g7 with check. And when black retakes, play rook takes d8. The bishop at g5 and the rook would meet at d8, and he would win material. So to stop that, international master German places his rook on d4 to block that file. But now fg7 check, king g7, and this move, bishop to f6 check. What Fischer obviously wants to do after king to g8, he would love to just play queen h4, queen h6, or queen g5 with check, and then just mate at g7. Very simple, queen h4, queen g5, queen g7, checkmate. So he begins that journey, queen to h4. So how does black stop this? He plays rook takes d1 check, and this is an interesting move. If Fischer takes with the rook, that would be a mistake. And all of a sudden, this big advantage he had, it'd be almost equal, because black would play bishop takes bishop. And if the pawn retakes, then this move, queen to e3 check, king to b1, and then queen to f4. Now notice this queen on f4 is perfectly positioned to stop white's queen from getting in on the dark squares. It pins this pawn at g4, so it can't move, because obviously he would lose the queen. And it keeps the h6 and g5 squares under control. And he would have fought back to near equality in this position if instead of the pawn capturing the queen takes, then just queen to e6. And again, it's a very close game at that point. So rook to d1 check, a strong idea, but what does Fischer do? Of course, he takes with the knight. And that makes all the difference in the world in this position. And it is enough to make black resign. Let's watch what would happen if he had not resigned. Say bishop takes f6, ef6, and now the rook attacks the queen, and there's nothing he could do to stop queen to g5 or queen to h6 coming in. Is queen e5, obviously, rook takes, and that would be the end of the game. So Fischer's rule for dealing with opponents that want to draw, make sure that the structure, the pawn structure itself, is asymmetrical. Don't let them get that symmetrical structure they want, and then the better player can win. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.